Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Between the Sharks. I find myself just pacing around this thing in a shocking turn of events. Things kind of worked out pretty well in the last episode. Here I am with the rear end somewhat mounted, meaning it's on its spring, it's clamped in place. Up until this point, I was like, well, as soon as I get there, then I can, modify the fenders and do the whole thing. And that's kind of partially what I want to do, but I think we need to pivot, and that's just how that goes sometimes. Welcome to Between the Sharks. So she's looking really good. I'm pretty jazzed with how it's coming together. Some of the gambles I made on these fenders and the frame and buying a bunch of parts, they've actually come together and made a pretty sharp looking car. Kind of like I imagined, but I think I got lucky that way that I didn't have to do too much reverse engineering or, chopping up with the frame or whatever to get there. So I want to keep going and get this body super solid and make her all looking good. But the reality is this frame is just barely slapped together. And I also peeled off the big dollar bills and ordered a full set of front brakes for this thing. So I think on the one hand, it's time to kind of undo the cool looking thing that we've got, which is a little bit disappointing, but considering none of that's bolted in either, it's like a 5-second step backwards, if it's even a step backwards. But the exciting part is we know enough now that this is going to work that we can also start building our chassis, actually getting it together and figuring it out, because we know our body and fender system is going to work the way we want it to with this general idea. So that feels like a turning point, boys. That feels, that's something. Now, we got to go from mock-up to automobile, and that's, we got a ways to go. I think we're going to start right here at the front end because I'm waiting for parts for the rear. So I've got these wishbones, I've got wishbone mounts, I've got all the stuff. I just don't know how this is set up. I did this just enough to hold the axle in place, and I think I did do some measuring, but we need to go back and just start over and check it all out. So let's dive in to what this front end setup is and how we're going to check it all out, which is basically the same process you would go through if you were doing your own split wishbone setup. All right, most of you that are watching this, you already know what a split wishbone is, but let's just give the basic information, because I did find a lot of times when I was learning, the basics were assumed. So we don't assume that here. The standard Ford wishbone setup held the axle in place with a perch like so, and made a wishbone shape, meaning this rod and this rod were connected in the middle under the center of the car, and they were a single piece, and the axle was mounted to the front of it. Now this did a couple things. This allowed the suspension to travel up and down. It also gave a central pivoting point. It is a much superior suspension setup to split wishbones. Split wishbones are not a hot rod performance thing. They're sort of a necessary evil to lower the car. Because once you start lowering the car, say with a dropped axle, like so, your wishbone clearance, your wishbones would hit the frame if they were still centered under the car. That's why they're split, to bring them to the outside of the frame rail. And if you put a bigger motor in, you might have some oil pan or other clearance issues with your steering and everything else once you've lowered it and put the bigger motor in. So necessary evil, not performance improvement. So what do? Well, they do 3 things basically. They hold the axle square to the front of the frame. So we got a cross member. You want your front wheels to be in a straight line so that you drive forward. Well, you need something, because the spring is only mounted at a center point, so the axle can pivot on that spring. You got to hold it in place. So what does that? Well, if you have a support that goes from the frame to the front of the axle, and it's an equal length on both sides, you will have an axle square to your frame, and you'll be able to track down the road straight. There is a little bit of an adjustment in your joint, whether you use a Heim joint or a tie rod end, to do a fine tuning adjustment front to back. All right, so the second thing that the Wishbones do is with this pivot point, right, that allows the axle to go up and down, right, just like in the cartoon that I drew. But it also, the hind joint or the tie rod end allow for a little bit of rotation. So if you hit a bump only on this side, the axle has to twist. So it's flexing here on both sides, right, to allow the whole thing to twist. This is not the best setup at all. This setup is prone to binding and prone to forcing the axle to twist under extreme conditions. Again, this is not NASA engineering, but the system works. It really does work. Don't let anyone on a forum make you believe that splitting wishbones is actually a performance advantage. It is not. It just allows you to lower the car and look cool. So this is vanity. The final thing that your wishbone does that I did not include in my little cartoon is keep the caster correct. Meaning, on a Ford axle, the rule of thumb is you want 6 to 7 degrees of this kingpin leaning back toward the car, positive caster, right? And in order to do that, the only thing holding this angle is the angle of this spring perch. That is a fixed point. With Ford, there was zero adjustment in the original wishbones. They were built to hold the car at stock ride height, at stock caster, and it worked. Well, as soon as you split these things, I already said in the video, for our suspension travel reasons, we want this as parallel to earth as possible. That's about where I've got this one. I'll explain that in a second. In order to adjust the caster relative to this point, because this is the thing holding it in place, you actually have to pie cut the wishbone and force that gap to shrink or grow to rock the axle back and forth. If you're thinking about building a hot rod, now's a good time to consider like hairpins or a 4-link front setup, because that actually has adjustment. You can get pretty close on your initial setup and then adjust it and fine tune it. And that way, if you change your ride height or you change your wheels, you're not actually changing your caster. If I set this correctly and I jack up the rear end, well, that caster is going to change. In fact, it's going to rotate in the wrong direction. Just saying, you got options here. This is the one we're working with, so we're going to get it as right as we can. So let's keep yakking. I'm going to try to burn through this, like I said. So this mounting point, right, the way that I got here was I dropped it as low as I felt comfortable with, because there is such a thing as your scrub line. And like, let's say your tire goes over a speed bump. Well, the tire will be on the other side of the speed bump before this gets here. So as my speed bump is like right here, I don't want to be, you know, knocking my mounting point right off the car, because then, well, we won't be able to steer it, and that would be bad. So this is as low as I feel comfortable going. I mean, I've got other things that are this low. That allows me to be, I think it's like 6 degrees off being level, which would be my ideal if I had the choice because of all the things in the cartoon. So I'm willing to accept that. I got to this point because I had equal length wishbones, and I measured, basically, you got to find reference points that you can do on both sides of the car. So I went off of this mount forward, and I went off of this mount backwards, and I double checked off of this nut to the center once I was done of this bolt. And I basically, just like I do everything, find anything that you can match on both sides, triple like measure everything and find your best average. That's how it's going to work. That's how we got here. So now that I have the height for my wishbone, I have the length for my wishbone, I have to dial in this pie cut so I get 7 degrees at my kingpin, because that's what I'm going for. Is it hard? No. Does it take a ton of like triple check measuring in awkward positions, and does everything have to be set up to this point to get there with a wishbone? Yeah. Maybe there's a way to do this on the bench. I just don't know what it is. Because that 7 degrees is relative to the rake of the frame, which is relative to the mounting point of the wishbone, which is relative to the tire height. Everything kind of has to be together. There is a little room for error, a degree or two, but the closer you get, the better this thing is going to handle. All right, gang, we got to check the caster in our current setup, which I'm pretty sure is 5 degrees, but The way I do it, that seems to make the most sense to me, is to put a straight edge along the kingpin boss on the spindles, right? And you grab an angle doohickey, you can have a digital one, and put it against the straight edge. The reason I do it off the side of the kingpin is that's really where it matters. This side has Zerk fitting bosses, so that's not great. It's not an even surface. And you know, some people try to do it on the side of their axle, but you'll notice, you can probably kind of see, the drop axle has a taper. This is an aftermarket drop axle, and it certainly has it, meaning it's thinner here than it is here. Thus, that creates an angle that's, you know, will mess with your reading. And if you have a factory axle that's been dropped, this is where it's stretched, so that may not be straight. Just my 2 cents. Right now, I've got 5 degrees. So right now, I've got 5 degrees on both sides. But let's think about it. You know how I love rotating off pivot points and blah, blah, blahing about that endlessly. But once these are in a fixed position, once I've welded this angle in right here on the wishbone and it's attached to my fixed point, if I raise the car up in the back, that's going to rotate the axle this way. And if I put more weight on the car and it pushes this section down, it will rotate the axle downwards. That's got me thinking that 5 degrees is not bad right now. The engine is completely dry. I don't have a radiator up here. I don't have seats, gas tank, battery, me, right? So in theory, because point A is right at the axle and that's being held up by a tire, that's not gonna go down anymore. But the frame may go down relative to the axle when I add all the weight, possibly a degree or 2. I already have the rear suspension kind of mocked up with the right tire size that I'm gonna run, so this rake is somewhat real. All right, gang, so the suspension is kind of mocked up. The spring in this cross member is actually carrying the front suspension, and in the back, the spring is actually carrying the weight of the car, and the engine is sort of sitting in here being supported by the frame. There's no jack stands under the car anywhere. Everything is just tack welded. But now, we've measured the kingpins. I'm at 5 degrees right now. So if I lift the rear of the frame, it's going to take this mounting point with it, thus rotating the axle forward, because we're sitting on tires right here. Which means if we add weight to the car, which we have to do at some point, you can see this mounting point will actually move down. And that means as this mounting point moves down a little bit, as we add weight to the car, because this point is fixed, it's going to actually rotate the axle just a little bit with every pound that's added to the car. So it's quite likely that at 5 degrees right now, once we add seats, people, you know, gas tank, battery, all of that stuff, we're gonna drop the frame down a little bit, which is going to cause the axle to rotate, just a fuzz. And I think that will increase our angle from 5 degrees to closer to 7, maybe between 7 and 9. That's an estimate, it's an educated guess. But what that means is I think we're actually in good shape at the current 5 degrees, relative. So it's important to measure this stuff a billion times. Just based on all this stuff, it's quite likely that depending on what parts I find, because a lot of stuff that I'm finding to build these cars, and I should do an episode on how I buy parts, but sometimes the cars are built by the parts that I can find that I think are cool, that I know will work. These Impala steering wheels and steering columns, early 60s, are super neat to me. I didn't have a steering column, those will work, the price was right. Bought them both for 175 bucks. I'm not bragging, but I'm bragging. I need to find a front suspension setup for this car, but my guts are, I think I'd rather do hairpins on it, because hairpins allow for caster adjustability. So does a 4-link. 4-link's a little too modern for me. Hairpins are as period as I need to be, and they provide an adjustment that Wishbones do not. I'm running Wishbones on this because they came with the frame, I kind of know how to set them up. They're gonna work just fine for what I need, but the process of doing so does take all of this extra effort if you want it to be right. And we're building cars here. They're a lot more fun to drive when they handle pretty well. These should be fun. So anyway, we're gonna get it right. Let's talk about getting it from, you know, pie cut to finished, because right now we sort of have to do it in the car, which is kind of a bummer. But if I jack it up, I change the relationship potentially. If I pull it out of the car, I change the relationship. So we got to get her to a point where we can get it tacked enough to roll this front end out and do all of our final welding. So here's the plan. I need something to fill this gap right here so that I can start welding. So I'm gonna take this cheap Harbor Freight micrometer here and get an idea of how many bigs this is. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm gonna jam something in there and tack weld it. So what do you guys see? I don't know, what do we got? 0.2695 inches. So if I can find a piece of 1/4-inch steel, I'm gonna be cooking with peanut oil. So let's go find one. All right, just got angle iron laying around, so I think this is good enough. All I really need is a chunk for a spacer. If I do it well enough, maybe I can leave this piece in and weld both sides so that we're not trying to close a 1/4-inch gap. Let's look at that. Sure, something like that. So I made a little template thing, very loose because it doesn't really matter. Went out to the hardware store and just bought the closest thing I can get, which is 3/16 by an inch. Now my gap was about 1/4, actually a little heavier than 1/4, but that's all right because I have an angled cut. So long as I jam this thing up as far as I can till it stops, when I weld it, it will make sure that there is no room like for that gap to close. In theory, I could weld this and just keep building the weld and fill this whole thing because it's a pie cut, but if you're doing that, you are indeed risking it shrinking and slowly closing as you cruise down. Basically, when the metal is hot, right, it's at its biggest it will ever be. The molecules are all as spread out as they possibly can be. That's what happens when you weld it and you fill the gap with that hot weld, and then as it cools, it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. Now, it wouldn't be a ton of shrinking, but we're talking about degrees here, so it's enough shrinking that we need to make sure that we've got a piece in here holding it that's forcing it open as we start to weld it up. We're gonna make this out of this piece of steel over here. We're gonna jam it in there, get it all tacked up on both sides, then we'll be able to roll this entire front end unit out, flip it over, and weld it properly. All right, gang, this is really hard to show you. This area to work in is really tight. This doesn't really fit in any particularly great way, but that's all right. If I weld from the wishbone, split on this side to this side, right where it is the tightest, that will effectively keep this welding from shrinking this gap, and it'll keep our relationship the same. If I can get a weld somewhere down here and it's not going to shrink anymore, I think that'll be more than enough to pull this whole system out, flip it over, fill the rest of these gaps, and probably do some filling of these gaps with a weld once we've got it solidly kind of braced here. That's the plan. And then we'll just grind down all the rest of the metal that's sticking off our tab there. So I have confirmed after putting these spacers in that we're at 5 degrees on both sides still, so it's time. My goal is to weld these just well enough to keep it from closing when I weld it further, or moving when I pull this whole front end out, because we'll pull it out and our welding will be much easier, and honestly we want the welds to be as good as possible, so doing this all out of position is not the greatest idea. But as we've covered already, you got to get this at least started in the car, in car conditions. Now that the welds are done, we're gonna have to jack the frame up, put it on jack stands. I'm gonna go ahead and take some measurements so I can get the frame back to where it is supposed to be sitting, so that while we're working on the front end, if we run into a parts issue or whatever, our rake will stay the same so that we can move to the rear and know that our frame is in the orientation we need it to be in order to do the similar type work on the back end. Let's get after it. All right, gang, this is not the most elegant solution, but it is going to work just fine. I just now can get in here and show you the plan, really. So this weld is just above this piece, and that's keeping any shrinking weld from closing this gap. So now we can take a grinder and go ahead and trim this thing as flush as possible, grind it down, and then we can weld the whole thing. We'll have a little bit of a gap, but by the nature of it already being pinned, the odds of it being able to shrink at all are slim to none. Have a similar situation over on this side, but once this is done, we're locked into our caster angle. There we go. All right, it's 68.76 billion degrees in here. Now, I wasn't trying to grind these smooth because there's a factory weld seam there, and frankly, it just doesn't make any difference. That's a vanity thing. Having a little bit extra on there is not gonna hurt anything. See no cracks in the welds. I don't know if you could tell in the slow-mo, but I was kind of jamming this screwdriver down in the gap. It wasn't really to hold things open, it was to confirm my theory that everything was in place. So I put this in kind of tightly, did my welds, and I was able to slide it right back out like Excalibur, proving to me at least enough that nothing was moving, like that my weld was not causing anything to shrink and pinch. So I didn't expect it to, but I don't know. Made me feel better maybe. There we go. We've sent our caster with our Wishbones. That's a big step. It's kind of a tedious and intimidating thing to do because it's kind of basically, in order to correct this now, we've got to do another pie cut or move our mounts. Both are possible, but you know, you want to commit to where you think you want it anyway. So I guess I'm gonna give this a quick rattle can paint job because, you know, we're not going for high finish. It's gonna be under a car, it's gonna be a fendered car, but whoever put this like silver paint on here, that's just beyond me. That's you're not convincing anyone that's chrome. So a good satin chassis black or whatever can I have on the shelf is going to do the trick. So this is my go-to stuff here, Rust-Oleum satin black. It sticks to mostly anything, and it's a very similar color to what I think is a factory chassis black. Like, you know, I've seen some pretty nice early Ford cars and early other cars, but you never tell with the restoration or if it's original. But the short version, I think it's just the right sheen. It matches Eastwood's chassis black actually, and maybe some others, but you can always touch it up because it comes in a rattle can or a roll-on if you really want a nice finish. Clearly, that's not what I'm going for. In fact, you know, I didn't even wait for it to dry before I flipped it over and threw it right onto that cinder block. So I'm not really going for a nice paint job. I was just looking for one color. Frankly, this is very, very minimally more rust protected than it was moments ago with its coat of surface rust. I'm of the mindset that if my car ends up at a car show with mirrors underneath it, I've done something wrong. All right, gang, not bad for a Saturday afternoon. We knocked out the most difficult part of a Wishbone setup in my mind, which is quadruplify checking your caster angle and getting it welded in place solidly just where you want it. And I think we're all set up and ready to go. The rattle can paint job, you know, I did it just to make everything one color and kind of look fresher. No, I did zero prep. I didn't even wipe it down, no sanding. You guys paint your chassis parts to the quality that you want your chassis parts painted. Just a really quick recap, you know, once you split your wishbones or get split wishbones, make sure they're the same length to start. Then you kind of have to guess at your angle. So on tires, this will be up a little further, but we still have a bit of an uphill thing going on, and that's a compromise, right? I didn't want to drop my mount lower. Figure out what you're okay with. Get your mount equal on both sides, both from down from the frame and back from the front of the axle. And to do that, just measure, find reference points. Anything that matches on both sides, use as many as you can find until you're happy with it. Once that's done, make sure that your pie cut in your stock Wishbones is allowing for the correct caster at your kingpin. After that, you just gotta make it so. You gotta make it stay there forever and ever. So now that we've done that, we're ready to move on, and that's pretty groovy. We can, you know, finalize our bracket welding. We can start adding brakes. We can start looking at shock mounts. We can start looking at steering. This is actually in place. Remember, that pie cut was just sitting there like wide open, meaning if we put too much pressure or too much weight on the system, the axle could have actually just been a lever and just split that thing wide open. Now we're good. Now we can start putting wheels on this, adding weight to the frame, and doing all the rest of the stuff. So, at least for the front end. Still gotta locate the rear. But anyway, that's another episode, and so is the rest of this front end. So I hope this was helpful if you're trying to build a hot rod kind of like this. If not, I hope it was mildly entertaining, and we will see you next time on Between the Sharks. Thanks for watching. As always, good luck on your projects out there.